So quick context on the meeting going on. So this is a manager training for 360 feedback by the people business partners. Everybody went into breakout rooms to discuss scenarios we've set up, and everybody's now coming back from that breakout room where we will discuss their findings. So we're going to get a few more seconds for everybody to return, and then Juliana will take it away and discuss and hear about the findings from the group on the scenarios.
Thanks, Rose. I think everyone is back. Thanks so much, y'all. We hopped around a little bit into discussions, and it seems like you were having some great ones. So for the rest, the remainder of the 20 minutes we have together, we'll spend it discussing your key takeaways, thoughts, any questions that may have arisen as you discuss the 3 scenarios. So we'll start with scenario 1, the values alignment. We had 5 breakout groups. Does anyone want to jump in kind of on behalf of their group and provide a summary, key takeaways of what your discussion was like for this one?
I can do that for whatever group we were. So I think there were some really great points just about, Matt mentioned inquiring ahead of time about how people wanted to receive that feedback. And I think that was a great call out for how to make that feedback more approachable. I really like that Michael mentioned kind of slacking before, just to set expectations for that this would be a discussion in the next one-on-one. So kind of getting the right mindset to the individual. I think a common theme we talked about through all of them was just it would be highly dependent on what the individual person, who that person was and how they wanted to receive that feedback. So a lot of this is it would be dependent on the relationship involved. Yeah, I think that's most of what we discussed for that one.
Yeah, for sure. I love that y'all called out the importance of how people prefer to receive feedback, because this changes a lot from person to person. So it's a really good theme. Any other groups?
I can speak. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, thanks. Our group, I don't know what number we were. One of the things that we talked about in prep, like Jeff was saying, is doing a little bit more research, and we weren't entirely sure, and maybe Juliana, you can help us with this, if we as the manager would be able to see who submitted it, because one of the things that we wanted to identify is, like, are these potential unconscious microaggressions that they don't realize they're doing, or is it something that there really is a problem and we need to address? So trying to kind of research ahead of time and find out more about it. And then being able to offer solutions. So coming to the table when you have that 360 review to say, like, you received review that maybe you're not aligned with this particular value, DIBS value. There's this allyship course you can take in EdCast, or something like that, or learning more about unconscious bias and really going into it assuming that positive intent that they probably don't realize they're doing it and hopefully aren't doing it on purpose. And the whole point is self-awareness, right? So helping them become more self-aware and then offering those tools to try to remediate that behavior.
Absolutely. I love that solution-oriented approach. So it's not so much, it's focused on the feedback, but it's focused on what it looks like moving forward to get through it versus dwelling on the feedback in and of itself. To answer your first question, you won't be able to see who provided the feedback just because of the anonymity factor of the nature of this. But I think regardless, your approach works really well. One other thing I would maybe add is just, it mentioned in the scenario that you as the manager haven't observed this. So these are things that other people are saying. So maybe giving the team members space to kind of share their perspective, what they think on the feedback can help too, especially since you haven't observed the behaviors, to make sure that it's balanced and holistic, including the perspective of the team member.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that, Juliana.
Anyone else?
We also talked about how much context we were provided in the 360 example, that if there was an MR or an issue, we could pull it up and discuss it, but also reiterate the value, the specific value, and talk about it and solicit the person's point of view, because they might not know what they're doing. And another suggestion was maybe a trial scenario you could discuss a trial scenario and see how the person would behave. Ask them for their input. How would you behave in this particular scenario, to see if that would be helpful.
I won't be there in the afternoon.
Yes, Susan, absolutely. And I think that's kind of aligned. It reminds me of our interview process with the behavioral interviews. How people describe past situations and how they would act in future situations is very telling of how they approach those types of situations in general. So I like the process of kind of breaking things down for the team member and giving them a chance to walk you through to maybe identify what the root of the problem is. So that's a great suggestion.
I also linked the Crucial Conversations Handbook page in case everybody hasn't seen that. Great resource.
Love that, Chris. Thank you. Big fan of Crucial Conversations for anyone who hasn't gone through it yet. All right. Anyone else have anything they want to chime in on for scenario 1? Okay, I'll just add one more thing. The scenario didn't discuss the severity of the feedback in terms of our diversity, inclusion, and belonging value, but another thing to just keep in mind is our code of conduct. If some of the feedback was aligned in terms of a code of conduct violation, we want to reach out to our team member relations team as well. So the severity in terms of whether it is or is not a violation can kind of also dictate the course of action in this scenario, or rather whether you would add the looping in of the team member relations team too. All right, if there aren't any other questions on this one, we will move on to scenario 2. That was the contradictory feedback. Anyone want to kick us off with thoughts here?
This one is one of my favorite topics, so I'll just chime in. We were talking in our group, Dave, stop laughing because I'm going to use you as an example. So Dave on my team, I said, well, what if, I'm very self-aware and I'm getting all this great feedback, but not from Dave? You still have to take that into account. You still have to say whether you believe it's true or not. Those are Dave's words. That's Dave's impression. And you don't know how, what type of impact he has on your brand, on your career path. There's always a nugget of truth in any bit of feedback. And so I love doing these types of exercises with my team to make them more self-aware, because very often the way you think you're projecting and the way that you are projecting are not mutually exclusive. So this is like one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, Colleen, and kind of stemming off that, it's important to address and discuss every piece of the 360 feedback, but not every piece is a theme, right? So everyone's going to walk away with kind of areas of strengths that are key, improvement areas that are key, and not every single piece of feedback in terms of constructive feedback is going to feed into that. So if this came from just one person, let's say, and you haven't observed it as a manager, it may not fall into, the individual growth plan that stems from these conversations.
I think we're pretty fortunate as an organization, given that I think we attract a high number of people that are attracted to our values. So I think most people, if they're not living up to their values or they're not being perceived as living up to our values, they probably want to know that. So I think I really love that we have, a strong value-driven culture here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the presence of the values in everything we do at GitLab kind of puts us all on the same playing field in terms of expectations. That's a great point, Tim.
And I think to that point, Juliana, that's like, they are part of our conversation. I mean, I've worked at other technology companies where they've got values on pretty glass walls and cool art that, oh yeah, it's like, but here it's like really does feel like we're living. I know we're talking about scenario 2, but scenario 1, it was like, ooh, that's a serious allegation to say that someone's not living our values. So it's like, I think it does, GitLab and our culture have really set us up to have some of those conversations regularly. So in the 360, it's like the expectation's already there. So I think it's easier to say, hey, you were observed, or we got feedback that blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's not shocking. It's like, yeah, okay. Yeah, I wasn't as transparent as I could have been in this particular situation. how to be better, come up with a plan. So it was a long way to say I agree with Tim.
Yeah, that's a great call out. Go ahead.
I would just add, this was an interesting one for me because this happens all the time as a manager. You get contradicting feedback. I think that we need to explain to the direct report or the team member who's being reviewed that you might not be wrong. You just might need to communicate differently to some of your team members and really, check and make sure they understood what you said, because it could just be a matter of digesting information differently. And what works for one team member might not work for the other team member. And what's really helpful is if the manager themselves has a really good idea of the personalities and how people work on their team, because they can kind of guess, okay, this person, they can probably kind of guess who it is. But I also mentioned in our group is that if a manager is surprised by any feedback, the first question they should ask themselves is what can I do better as a manager to be more knowledgeable of like kind of what's going on with the team. And if really shouldn't be the first time that you're hearing of this. And someone mentioned, well, maybe it's because they're talking about a counterpart and you usually don't see the interaction with counterparts. Well, then maybe I should be meeting regularly with the counterparts just to make sure everything's going well. So, but my main message would be that it's not necessarily that you're wrong. You just might need to be more flexible in your communication style. So I would start off with assuming positive intent.
Yeah, I love that.
I might elaborate a little bit off of that, Darva, because I think you're right. It might be sort of situational too. Like if your peer that you work with on your team, might see you more often and you're like, yeah, you're great with collaboration. And then there might be a different department that you only work with, a couple of times. And so they might see it a little bit differently. And so like you kind of said, hopefully you get some examples or, we don't know who said it, but at least maybe getting some examples or situations that you can look at and say, okay, well, in this situation, you did a really great job collaborating. And then in this situation, you kind of missed the mark. Did you approach them differently? Was it a comfort level or someone in our group, I think, Natasha, I apologize, I believe you said it, but is it a confidence issue too? Like if you're working with a peer, you might be more comfortable sharing your ideas than maybe you're in a meeting where you're a little bit not as knowledgeable or higher levels and you're not as comfortable with that collaboration. So I think part of it could be situational as well. So really understanding the differences kind of in those scenarios.
Megan, I went in kind of a similar direction where it's like asking myself, is this an emerging skill? If we're trying to do something better or differently, then sometimes we can trip as we're, building those new muscles. So that could be part of it too.
For sure. Thanks, Chris.
I think going off of what Chris, Megan, and Darva all said, opening the floor to the team member to start these conversations, especially if there's something that you think may be sensitive, can also be really effective. Like, hey, when you reviewed your feedback, was there anything that was surprising or upsetting or maybe just a little off for you? And that can be a nice setup for them to give you some of those examples that you've highlighted. Like, yes, I received this feedback and I think maybe in this situation I did XYZ. My intent wasn't to not be collaborative, but I can see how it could have come off this way. And it kind of puts them in a more introspective space, or can right off the bat.
I really like the idea of like kind of teeing them up to respond to the feedback at a higher level before you get into the specifics. So it feels more like a dialogue versus you just kind of like talking at them.
For sure. For sure. All right, in the interest of time, you've got 6 minutes. Let's move on to scenario 3. This was the underperformance scenario. Who wants to kick us off here?
Jump in.
Like I've done a lot of talking, but, right? It's me and Chris, right? That's how it's going to be. Please stop us from talking. But no, I think this one is kind of similar to what we were just talking about with like situational or scenarios. And so if you have a perception from other team members that like if they're stellar and this person is neutral, they're performing, they're doing their best, the contrast might make it seem like they're not. And so kind of digging into kind of see, well, maybe not who provided the feedback, but were they self-aware? Did they recognize it? Did I recognize it? Kind of looking at the different perspectives there and trying to identify that theme, which I think is kind of what we've talked about with most of these.
Yeah.
I would say, we actually didn't get to this one, but I would say, first thing, go to the handbook and read about underperformance, because the process sometimes changes. So we have to stay up to date. And I will reach out to my people business partner. But I think that underperformance is a lot more of a serious conversation, but you can get underperformance feedback outside of this 360 feedback cycle. It's really not specific to this. And I would investigate it like I would investigate any other underperformance report, but I would stick really closely with the handbook.
I agree, Darva. I thought that the first thing that jumped out to me was, well, surely we've had conversations before we got to the 360. Because if there's an underperformance issue, you got to nip that in the bud. It's like, as soon as you start hearing things or observing things, should be bringing that up in your regular one-on-ones. It's like team members should never be surprised by constructive feedback. So it's like, hopefully I think for me, if we got to the 360, I think it's what we talked about as a group. I think group 5 was like, this is a great opportunity to say, this isn't only my observations. I'm hearing this is supported from members of the team. So it's like in using that as an opportunity for a get well plan. That's like, even if you wouldn't formally PIP them yet, that's like, all right, where do we go from here? I come up with an action plan with some milestones to kind of help them feel like they're improving.
I love your call out in terms of no surprises, Chris. I think that's so key. Sometimes surprises come in through these 360 reviews. It's not that they never do, but y'all as managers, what's in your control is getting behind some of this early and making sure that team members are receiving that ongoing feedback from you. So especially from the manager perspective, there shouldn't ever be things that come up, strength or improvement areas for the first time in a 360.
We're talking scenario 16, right? Or slide 16.
Correct.
Super disappointing that our mascot is underperforming. I'll just put that out there. The fact that pretty bummed that a raccoon dog can't be a little more predictable. I read this scenario that we as managers in this scenario, we are committed to an idea of providing both positive and constructive feedback. Yet the peers that were part of the 360 and real world is going to be part of each of our 360s. We're going to potentially get some surprises that might feel sort of from colleagues or maybe secondary or tertiary groups that we work around. So I read this scenario that how do we filter and provide that feedback to this specific team member? And I ultimately think if you bring it to them and say, here's my feedback about you, I've gathered some additional as part of this process. What do you think, before I open it up, what do you think Chris's feedback might be, positive or negative, about working with you, right? So then what you're really trying to do is kind of separate their heart from their head just for a moment. And that way they might say, well, her and I got sideways on this project and she was wrong, I was right. And, oh, okay, now we've got something we can actually work on. But it might be better than saying, hey, several of your peers were pretty unfiltered and unvarnished with their feedback, and it's less balanced. It's either incredibly positive without a lot to work on, or it's incredibly challenging. So I would probably preface, if I spoke to Tanuki, I would probably preface and try to get a gauge how well they're actually reading the room first.
I think it's also a great time to talk through how your action or Tanuki's actions and behaviors can impact their wider team, and for them to be more aware of that and more sensitive to that, and really call out like your actions do have a huge amount of influence. And it's showing in what we're gonna look at.
Yeah, I loved your thought, Tim, as well, on teeing it up, because sometimes feedback on improvement areas can feel really dominating and overwhelming for the team member and shadow out all of the strengths. So you as a manager, if you perceive difficult feedback for one of your team members, coming to the conversation by saying, look, these are my takeaways, this is what I saw, let's talk through it, to make it feel more balanced and holistic. I think that's a great recommendation. We are 22 seconds over. Thank y'all so much for your candid conversation and thoughtfulness that you put into this and willingness to share. We have another session later this afternoon for APEC in Americas. If anyone wants to join a second time and it accommodates your time zone, feel free to jump on. We welcome feedback on the format of this. We've been kind of trying out the scenario breakout room structure for manager training the past couple. So feel free to let Rose and I know if you have any thoughts, and happy feedbacking.
Thank you all.
Thank you.